I stood on my graduation stage while the crowd cheered and 3 seats stayed empty. My parents skipped my graduation to calm my sister's tantrum. No apology, no explanation, just a text saying they couldn't make it. In that moment, I realized love in my family was conditional. I smiled for photos, packed my gown in silence, and made a quiet decision that would expose years of lies and leave my parents panicking for answers they weren't ready to hear. My name is Quinn Carter, and for most of my life I was known as the easy one, the strong one, the daughter who didn't need much. That label followed me everywhere, spoken like praise but lived like a limitation. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Detroit, the kind of neighborhood where lawns were trimmed on schedule and nothing looked out of place from the street. Our house fit perfectly into that picture. Neutral paint, family photos lined neatly along the entryway, a dining table polished every Sunday afternoon as if order itself were a virtue. From the outside, we looked like a family that had everything figured out. Inside, though, everything revolved around my older sister, Vanessa. Vanessa was my parents' pride and their constant concern. From as early as I can remember, she was described with the same set of words: fragile, emotional, sensitive, someone who needed extra care. My parents said it so often it stopped sounding like opinion and started sounding like law. Vanessa was upset, plans changed. If she wanted something, everyone adjusted. If she struggled, the rest of us slowed down to accommodate her. I learned early that peace in our house depended on one thing: giving way. So I did. I learned how to smile and step back. I learned how to read the room and decide whether my needs were worth the disruption. Most of the time they weren't. Being easy meant being quiet. Being strong meant asking for less. I didn't disappear entirely. I just learned how to take up less space. Birthdays told the story better than anything else. Vanessa's birthdays were loud and elaborate. Balloons brushing the ceiling, restaurant tables pushed together to fit relatives, laughter spilling into the parking lot as if joy itself needed an audience. Mine were smaller. Store-bought cake, a rushed hug, my mom smiling while glancing at her phone, already half somewhere else. "We'll do something bigger next year," she'd say. Next year never came. At dinner, I'd reach for the last piece of chicken and hear my dad clear his throat. "Leave it for your sister," he'd say gently, like it was advice, not instruction. "You don't need much. You're strong." I believed him. I believed strength meant restraint. That wanting less made you better, not neglected. Over time, that belief settled into my bones. School became my refuge, not because I loved attention, but because achievement felt like proof that I existed. I worked hard because effort was something I could control. When I brought home awards or good grades, my parents nodded like it was expected. "That's great, Quinn," my mom would say, already turning to ask Vanessa how her day went. When Vanessa had a bad one, everything else stopped. Homework could wait. Celebrations could be postponed. My accomplishments learned to arrive quietly, sit politely, and leave without making a mess. Still, I held on to one quiet hope: graduation. I told myself that moment would be different. 4 years of late nights, part-time work, endless stress, and quiet perseverance surely earned me something more than a nod. I imagined them in the crowd. My mom crying. My dad clapping too loudly. I imagined being chosen just once, without comparison or condition. That hope is what made the empty seats hurt later. But at the time, it felt reasonable. It felt earned. The truth is, the warning signs were there long before graduation day. I just learned how to ignore them. The night before the ceremony, my phone lit up with my mom's name. Her voice was low and rushed, the way it always got when Vanessa was involved. "Honey, your sister's not doing well," she said. "She's overwhelmed. Emotional. We might need to stay back tonight." Stay back. Not "we'll try our best." Not "we'll be there no matter what." Just a soft suggestion, like my graduation was a flexible appointment that could be moved around her mood. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my folded gown laid out for the morning. "It's just one day," I said carefully. "It only happens once." There was a pause. Then my mom sighed. "You know how she is, Quinn. You're strong. You'll understand." That sentence landed heavier than any argument ever could. "You're strong" wasn't comfort. It was a verdict. Meant don't ask. Don't push. Don't make this harder. I told myself they'd still come. I told myself they'd figure it out in the morning. Vanessa always had storms like this, and somehow the world always kept spinning. Surely this time would be different. The morning of graduation, the house felt unnaturally quiet. No calls. No updates. I dressed alone, adjusted my cap in the mirror, and tried to ignore the tightness in my chest. When I texted to ask where they were, the reply came quickly and without emotion. "We can't make it. Your sister needs us." That was it. No apology. No pride. No acknowledgement of what this day meant to me. Standing in the stadium hours later, I watched other families lean across rows to wave, to shout names, to hold up phones. I felt the heat of the sun on my shoulders and the cold clarity settling in my bones. This wasn't about an emergency. This was about hierarchy. And I knew exactly where I stood in it. As I walked back to my seat after my name was called, something inside me shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It was quieter than that, like a door closing. I thought about every time I'd waited patiently. Every time I'd told myself love would show up if I earned it. Every time I'd accepted being second as long as it meant keeping the peace. That night, alone in my apartment, I folded my gown in silence. I didn't argue. I didn't confront anyone. I replayed the message again and again. "Your sister needs us." And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd never dared to ask before. What if this never changes? I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I opened my closet, pulled out an old suitcase, and set it on the floor. Because in that moment I finally understood something terrifying. If I stayed, I would keep disappearing. Favoritism in my family was never announced out loud. No one ever sat me down and said, "Your sister matters more than you." It didn't need to be said. It was enforced quietly, consistently, through 1,000 small decisions that always landed the same way. Growing up, I learned that everything in our house operated on an invisible scale, and Vanessa's needs always outweighed mine. If she was tired, dinner ran late. If she was upset, plans were cancelled. If she was anxious, the rest of us tiptoed around her mood like it was fragile glass. My parents spoke about her emotions with reverence, like they were sacred and dangerous all at once. Vanessa's feelings were storms that required immediate shelter. Mine were light rain, inconvenient but manageable. I absorbed that lesson early. When I came home from school excited about something, a good grade, a compliment from a teacher, an invitation to join a club, I learned to check the temperature of the room before speaking. If Vanessa was sulking on the couch or snapping at my mom, I kept quiet. My news could wait. My joy could wait. It always did. Over time, that waiting became instinct. I didn't feel wronged. I felt responsible for maintaining balance. That responsibility settled onto my shoulders without anyone asking if I wanted it. At family gatherings, relatives praised Vanessa's sensitivity and creativity while describing me as mature for my age. So independent. So low maintenance. The adults smiled when they said it like it was a compliment. What they didn't see was how those words boxed me in. Being low maintenance meant I wasn't supposed to need anything. Being mature meant I wasn't supposed to complain. If I did, it felt like a betrayal of the role everyone had agreed I played. Even when Vanessa lashed out, slammed doors, or accused everyone of not understanding her, my parents framed it as stress, pressure, too much on her plate. When I stayed quiet and swallowed my frustration, it was framed as strength. "Look at Quinn," my dad would say. "She handles things so well." I didn't realize then that handling things well often just means handling them alone. As we got older, the pattern only deepened. When Vanessa struggled in school, tutors were hired. Deadlines were negotiated. Teachers were called. When I struggled, I adjusted. I stayed up later. I worked harder. I told myself this was fairness. She needed help. I didn't. That story was easier to believe than the alternative. By the time I reached my teenage years, favoritism had hardened into routine. Vanessa's crises became the organizing principle of our family life. Vacations were rescheduled. Dinners were tense. Weekends were unpredictable. My parents were perpetually on alert, waiting for the next emotional drop. I became skilled at shrinking my presence, at smoothing conversations, at redirecting attention away from myself before it caused friction. I thought I was being considerate. I didn't realize I was disappearing. There were moments when the imbalance was impossible to ignore. Once, I made varsity on my school's academic team after weeks of preparation. The competition fell on the same weekend. Vanessa decided she didn't want to attend a family friend's wedding. My parents chose to stay home with her. I went alone. Another time, I was accepted into a summer program I had dreamed about for years. The acceptance letter sat on the kitchen counter while my mom spent hours on the phone calming Vanessa down over a fight with a friend. When I finally mentioned the program, my mom smiled distractedly and said, "That's wonderful, honey, we'll talk about it later." Later never came. I learned that later was just another word for never when it came to me. Despite everything, I didn't hate my sister. That's what made it so complicated. Vanessa didn't wake up one day and decide to be the center of gravity. She had been raised to expect it. Every time she struggled, the world rearranged itself to make room for her. That kind of reinforcement doesn't create self-awareness. Creates entitlement wrapped in vulnerability. I saw it clearly even then, but I didn't feel allowed to name it. Whenever I tried to point out the imbalance, my parents shut it down quickly. "You're comparing," my mom would say. "That's not healthy." Or worse, "Why can't you just be happy for your sister?" The message was clear. Acknowledging the problem made me the problem. So I stopped acknowledging it. I told myself families weren't supposed to be fair. I told myself love came in different forms. I told myself my parents showed love by trusting me to handle things on my own. It was a convincing story because it made endurance feel noble. But endurance without care slowly becomes erosion. I felt it in subtle ways. In how I hesitated before asking for help. In how I downplayed my own stress. In how I apologized for needing things that were reasonable. When friends commented on how independent I was, I smiled. Independence sounded better than neglected. By the time college applications rolled around, the dynamic was so ingrained it felt natural. Vanessa's decisions were discussed at length. Her anxieties were managed collectively. My plans were announced after the fact. I chose a school close enough to be practical, far enough to breathe. My parents congratulated me, proud but unsurprised. "Of course you'll do fine," my dad said. "You always do." It wasn't meant to hurt, but it did. Fine meant invisible. Fine meant not worth rearranging anything for. Still, I carried hope with me. Quiet hope, but hope nonetheless. I believed there would be a moment when my consistency would be seen, when my steadiness would be rewarded. Graduation became that symbol in my mind. The proof that all the patience, all the waiting, all the silence had meaning. I didn't realize then how dangerous that hope was. Because when love is conditional, the condition is never finally met. Just keeps moving. And by the time I stood on that stage years later, the rules of our family were already set in stone. Favoritism wasn't a flaw. It was policy. And I was about to see exactly how little room there was for me within it. By the time my final year of college arrived, graduation had taken on a meaning far bigger than a ceremony. It wasn't just about finishing school or walking across a stage. It had become a quiet promise I made to myself. A belief that if I endured long enough, if I kept doing everything right, there would be a moment when my parents would finally look at me and choose me without hesitation. I didn't say this out loud to anyone because saying it would have made it fragile. I carried it privately. The way you carry something you're afraid might disappear if exposed. Every late night in the library, every shift at my part-time job, every exam I took while exhausted fed into that belief. This will be the moment. This is where it changes. I imagined it in small, vivid ways. My mom leaning forward in her seat, eyes scanning the program for my name. My dad standing up a little too fast when it was called, clapping louder than everyone else. I imagined their pride not as a reaction to comparison, not as relief that I wasn't a problem, but as genuine recognition. Felt reasonable to want that. Graduation only happens once. It marks years of work, discipline, and growth. Surely that was enough to earn undivided attention for one day. I didn't frame it as competition with Vanessa. I framed it as a milestone that existed outside of her orbit. I thought that was possible. Leading up to it, I made sure to communicate clearly. I sent them the date early. I reminded them casually in conversations. I shared details about seating and timing. They nodded and said of course wouldn't miss it. Those words settled into me like reassurance. I built my expectations on them. As the day approached, stress mounted the way it always does at the end of a long chapter. Finals, paperwork, packing my apartment, planning what came next. Through it all, graduation stayed fixed in my mind like a point of light. When things felt overwhelming, I told myself to just get through this. The payoff is coming. The week before the ceremony, Vanessa had one of her downturns. That wasn't unusual. There was always something. A conflict, a disappointment, a feeling she couldn't quite name but insisted was unbearable. Normally, I would have braced myself for what that meant, but this time I didn't. I told myself this was different. This time my parents would manage both. They had to. There was no reason they couldn't. That confidence carried me right up until the night before graduation. That was when my phone rang. My mom's name lit up the screen, and before I even answered, a familiar tension tightened in my chest. I knew the tone her voice would take before she spoke. Low, controlled, urgent. "Honey, your sister's not doing well," she said. "She's overwhelmed and emotional. We might need to stay back tonight." The word might hung there, deceptively gentle. I sat down on the edge of my bed, staring at my gown laid out neatly for the morning. "Stay back," I repeated quietly. "Not we'll figure it out. Not we'll come tomorrow no matter what. Just stay back." I told her it was one day. That it only happened once. There was a pause, then a sigh, heavy with resignation. "You know how she is, Quinn. You're strong. You'll understand." That sentence landed like a weight. It was the same one I'd heard my whole life. The phrase that ended discussions before they began. "You're strong" meant don't ask for more. Don't make this harder. Don't need us right now. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I told myself it wasn't final. I told myself they'd still come. Vanessa always had moments like this, and somehow my parents always found a way to show up eventually. I clung to that logic because the alternative was too painful to consider. The morning of graduation arrived with a stillness that felt unnatural. I woke up early, my stomach tight, my thoughts racing. Checked my phone. No messages. No reassurance. I showered, got dressed, adjusted my cap in the mirror, practicing a smile that felt a little too deliberate. I sent a text asking where they were, trying to sound casual. The reply came quickly. "We can't make it. Your sister needs us." That was all. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of what this day meant to me. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my hands trembling slightly. Something inside me went very quiet. Standing in the stadium later, surrounded by noise and movement, I felt strangely detached. Families waved across rows. Names were shouted. Cameras flashed. I scanned the crowd even though I knew better. 3 seats stayed empty, glaring in their absence. When my name was called, I walked across the stage, lights blinding, applause roaring from strangers who didn't know me, and I smiled because that's what you do. Inside, something hollowed out. It wasn't just sadness. It was clarity. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad timing. This was a choice. As I walked back to my seat, I felt a shift, subtle but irreversible. Like a door closing softly somewhere deep inside. That night, alone in my apartment, I folded my gown carefully and placed it in the back of my closet. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I replayed the message again and again. Your sister needs us. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd spent years avoiding. What if this never changes? The answer frightened me because it felt true. If I stayed, if I kept waiting, if I kept believing that the next milestone would finally tip the scales, I would keep disappearing. That realization didn't come with anger. Came with resolve. Quiet. Steady. I opened my closet, pulled out an old suitcase, and set it on the floor. I didn't know exactly what would happen next, but I knew one thing with certainty. I couldn't keep building my life around the hope of being chosen by people who had already shown me where I stood. The night before graduation should have been quiet in the way important nights are, the kind of calm that lets you breathe and take in what you've earned, but instead it felt suspended, like something unresolved was hovering just out of sight. After I hung up with my mom, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at the folded gown, replaying her words in my head until they lost their tone and became facts. Your sister isn't doing well. You're strong. You'll understand. I had heard those phrases my entire life, but something about hearing them on the eve of the one day that was supposed to be mine stripped them of their usual softness. They sounded procedural, like lines from a script that had been used too many times to feel sincere. I told myself not to read into it. I told myself not to spiral. This was what I always did when things felt uncomfortable. I minimized. I rationalized. Waited. I lay down without really sleeping, my mind drifting between memories and imagined corrections, rehearsing versions of the next day where my parents arrived late but smiling, where Vanessa calmed down just enough, where everything aligned at the last second. By morning, the hope had thinned into something brittle, but it was still there. I moved through my apartment slowly, deliberately, as if speed might shatter whatever was left of it. The silence felt louder than usual. No calls. No updates. I checked my phone too often, pretending I wasn't. When I finally sent the text asking where they were, my hands shook just enough for me to notice. The reply came back quickly, clean and final. We can't make it. Your sister needs us. There was no punctuation beyond the period. No softening words. No acknowledgement that this was the culmination of years of work. The clarity of it hit me harder than any argument could have. I sat down on the edge of the bed again, phone in my lap, and felt something inside me go still. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't chaos. This was priority. Standing in the stadium later, surrounded by noise and movement, I felt detached from my own body, like I was watching the day unfold through glass. Families leaned across rows to wave, to shout names, to hold up phones. I noticed details I hadn't expected to register. The way parents practiced cheers under their breath, the way siblings argued over who would get the better picture, the way pride looked loud and messy and alive. I scanned the crowd even though I knew better, my eyes drawn to the same 3 seats again and again, empty and unmistakable. When my name was called, the lights washed over me, applause rose. And I smiled because that's what you do when you've been trained to perform strength. I walked across the stage, shook a hand, accepted a folder that felt lighter than it should have, and turned back toward my seat. Somewhere in that short walk, the last of my illusions fell away. It wasn't dramatic. There was no surge of anger, no rush of tears. It felt more like a door closing quietly in a room I didn't realize I was standing in. That night, alone in my apartment, I folded my gown with care and placed it at the back of my closet. I didn't call my parents. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't need them. The message had said everything. Your sister needs us. It was a sentence that erased context, history, and effort all at once. I sat on the floor for a long time after that, letting the silence settle. And for the first time I asked myself a question I had avoided for years because it scared me too much to say out loud. What if this never changes? The answer came without hesitation. It won't. And in that moment, I understood something that terrified me more than being alone. If I stayed, if I kept waiting for permission to matter, I would keep disappearing piece by piece until there was nothing left to fight for. That realization didn't make me cry. Steadied me. I stood up, opened my closet, pulled out an old suitcase and set it on the floor. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't dramatize it. I let the quiet do the talking. Because for the first time I wasn't reacting to their choices. I was responding to the truth. Graduation day unfolded the way important days often do when you're trying too hard to convince yourself everything is fine. The sky was clear, the campus buzzing, families spilling out of cars with flowers and cameras and oversized pride. And I moved through it all like someone slightly out of sync with the world around her. I arrived early, walking across familiar paths that suddenly felt temporary, like I was already leaving something behind. I lined up with my classmates, adjusted my cap, listened to the nervous jokes and excited chatter, and nodded at the right moments, performing normalcy with the same precision I'd spent my whole life perfecting. Inside, I kept checking my phone, not because I expected a message, but because hope is stubborn even when you know better. When we were ushered into the stadium, the noise hit first. Applause rolled like waves, cheers bouncing off concrete, names being shouted from every direction. I followed the line to my assigned seat and sat down, heart beating faster than it should have. That was when I saw them. Or rather, when I didn't. 3 empty seats in a row, right where my parents and sister were supposed to be. They stood out immediately, a gap in the crowd that felt louder than the applause. I looked away, then back again, as if they might fill themselves if I blinked hard enough. They didn't. Around me, classmates were pointing out their families, waving, standing to take photos. Someone nearby laughed and said they could hear their mom screaming their name from across the stadium. I smiled automatically, the expression settling onto my face without effort, muscle memory kicking in. I had learned how to smile through disappointment long before this moment. The ceremony began. Speeches blurred together, words about perseverance and achievement floating past without landing. I kept my gaze forward, shoulders straight, posture composed. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted back to those empty seats, my mind filling them with versions of my parents that weren't there. My mom leaning forward, my dad clapping, Vanessa looking bored but present. Each imagined version dissolved as quickly as it formed. When my name was finally called, the moment I'd rehearsed in my head for years arrived without warning. I stood up, heart pounding, legs steady despite everything, and walked toward the stage. The lights were blinding, the applause loud, and for a split second I felt weightless, suspended between who I had been and who I might become. I smiled for the camera because that's what you do when you've been trained to be strong. I shook a stranger's hand, accepted a folder that represented years of work, and turned back toward my seat. As I walked, something inside me shifted. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was clarity, sharp and undeniable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't bad timing. This was a choice that fit perfectly into a pattern I had spent my life excusing. When I sat down again, the ceremony continued as if nothing had happened, and that was the most unsettling part. The world didn't pause to acknowledge the moment that broke something in me. Just kept going. When it was over, families flooded the field, hugging, laughing, taking photos that would live on walls and social media for years. I stood at the edge of it all, watching, phone in hand, wondering if I should text again, if I should ask why, if I should give them another chance to explain. I didn't. I already knew the answer. I took a few photos with friends, accepted congratulations, said the right words, and left early. Back in my apartment, the quiet hit differently. I set my keys down, kicked off my shoes, and stood there in my gown, the fabric suddenly heavy on my shoulders. I folded it carefully, smoothing the creases, treating it with more care than the day itself had received, and placed it in the back of my closet. I sat on the floor and replayed the text in my mind. Your sister needs us. It echoed until it lost meaning and became truth. That night I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't draft messages I'd never send. I sat with the realization that had been forming for years and finally finished taking shape. Love in my family wasn't unconditional. It was earned, rationed, and withdrawn the moment you stopped being convenient. And in that understanding, something else surfaced alongside the hurt. Resolve. Quiet, steady resolve. Because if I stayed, if I kept accepting empty seats and postponed promises, I would keep teaching them that I didn't need to matter. And for the first time, that felt like a lesson I refused to repeat. I didn't wake up the next morning with a plan written out or a dramatic sense of urgency, but something fundamental had changed overnight. The disappointment from graduation hadn't faded. It had settled, turning into a calm, unwavering certainty that felt heavier than anger and more reliable than hope. I moved through my apartment slowly, the way you do when you don't want to disturb a thought that finally feels clear. The sunlight came through the blinds in narrow strips, landing on the stack of notebooks on my desk, on the framed photos I had never bothered to rearrange because they were supposed to represent continuity. I stood there for a long time, coffee cooling in my hand, looking at my life as it was and realizing how much of it had been built around anticipation instead of agency. For years, I had been waiting for permission to matter, waiting for the moment when my parents would look at me without comparison and say you are enough on your own. Graduation had stripped that illusion bare. They hadn't failed to show up because of logistics or confusion or bad timing. They hadn't even pretended to try. They had made a choice that aligned perfectly with every choice before it, and I had finally stopped arguing with the evidence. The suitcase in my closet wasn't symbolic. It was practical. I pulled it out and set it on the floor without ceremony, the zipper rasping slightly as I opened it. I packed slowly, deliberately, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel each decision land. Few sweaters, work clothes, my laptop, the notebooks filled with late-night thoughts and half-formed plans. I didn't pack everything. I packed what mattered. As I moved through the apartment, memories surfaced, not nostalgically, but neutrally like items on a list. This was where I studied until dawn. This was where I waited for calls that didn't come. This was where I told myself next time would be different. I paused in front of a framed photo I hadn't looked at closely in years, me and my grandfather sitting on a porch. His arm resting lightly on my shoulder. No performance, no expectations, just presence. I took it off the wall and slipped it into my bag. The decision wasn't about punishment or escape. It was about self-preservation. Staying had become a slow erosion of my sense of self, and leaving felt like choosing oxygen after holding my breath for too long. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't send messages or ask for explanations. I knew that if I opened that door, it would become a negotiation, and I was done negotiating my worth. I locked the apartment behind me and drove west with the radio off, the road stretching out in front of me, steady and indifferent. Mile by mile, the tightness in my chest loosened into something colder and clearer. I wasn't running towards something new. I was stepping away from something that had already shown me its limits. When I reached Grand Rapids, my grandfather opened the door before I knocked, as if he had been waiting without knowing he was. He didn't ask why I was there. He didn't demand explanations. He set a mug of coffee in front of me and let the silence do its work. That silence was different from the one I had left behind. It wasn't empty. It was spacious. Over the next few days, the quiet from my parents was loud in its own way. No calls asking where I was. No concern masked as curiosity. The absence confirmed what I already knew. Then the messages started, not about me but about money. A bill that didn't go through. A payment that was overdue. The tone shifted quickly from casual to anxious, from confident to unsettled. That was when my grandfather finally spoke about something I hadn't known how to ask. He told me he had been helping my parents for years, quietly covering payments, smoothing gaps, keeping things stable when their finances came up short. He said it matter-of-factly, not as an accusation but as context. He believed he had been helping both of his granddaughters equally. He believed my parents were handling things responsibly. Hearing it felt like a fracture snapping cleanly into place. The stability I grew up with hadn't been earned. It had been borrowed. And the way they treated me suddenly made sense. It's easier to ignore the child you believe will survive. My phone buzzed again with another message asking if I had seen an account or moved anything by mistake. I didn't reply. I set the phone face down on the table and let the unanswered questions sit where they belonged. That night, my grandfather and I sat on the porch as the sky dimmed, the air cooling around us. He told me he was stepping back, that he was done fixing what he didn't break. They'll have to stand on their own, he said quietly. For the first time, I understood that my leaving wasn't just an escape. It was a shift. Support pulled away. a weight removed. And somewhere between the sound of crickets and the deepening dark, I realized this wasn't just about distance anymore. It was about consequences finally catching up, about a system unraveling once the quiet labor holding it together stopped. I went to bed that night knowing there would be fallout, knowing the calm wouldn't last, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel responsible for cushioning it. I had made a choice that felt small from the outside, almost invisible, but inside it was seismic. I had stopped waiting to be chosen and started choosing myself. And I knew that once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The shift didn't happen all at once the way disasters do in movies, loud and immediate. It unraveled in stages, the way unstable things always do when the pressure holding them together quietly disappears. At first, the messages from my parents were careful, almost casual, written in the tone people use when they're testing the ground beneath their feet. "Hey, did you change anything with the payments? Something didn't go through, just checking." I read the message once and set the phone down. I wasn't playing games and I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I just understood that if I answered one question it would open the door to 100 more, all circling the same truth they weren't ready to face. 2 days later the tone shifted. My mom called 3 times in one afternoon. I let the phone ring each time, watching her name light up the screen, feeling an unfamiliar steadiness in my chest. When I finally listened to the voicemail, her voice sounded tight, stretched thin in the way it always did when she was trying to stay calm for Vanessa. She talked fast, filling the silence with reassurance meant for herself more than for me. "We're just a little confused," she said. "Some bills are overdue. Your father thought maybe you saw something. You're good with details." Even now, I was being cast in the same role, the quiet fixer, the one who noticed problems and smoothed them out before anyone else had to feel uncomfortable. I didn't respond. That night, my grandfather asked me to sit with him at the kitchen table, the wood worn smooth from years of use, the light overhead soft and steady. He didn't rush and he didn't soften his words either. "I told them I'm stepping back," he said. "No more covering payments. No more fixing their mess." I stared at the grain of the table, the way the lines curved and intersected, grounding myself in something solid. "They're going to panic," I said. He nodded once. "They already are." The panic accelerated faster than I expected, like a structure collapsing once a key support beam is removed. By the end of the week, my dad showed up at my grandfather's house without warning. I saw his car pull into the driveway and felt a brief spike of tension that passed almost as quickly as it came. He knocked once, then again harder, and when I opened the door he stood there with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, jaw tight, eyes darting past me as if he expected someone else to step in and manage the moment. He looked smaller somehow, less certain, like a man who had lost his script. "We need to talk," he said. I didn't invite him in. We stayed right there, the door open behind me, the late afternoon air heavy and still. "What's going on?" he asked, though his eyes already knew. "Things are falling apart. We're behind on everything." I waited, resisting the instinct to fill the silence for him. He exhaled sharply. "Your sister's been having a hard time. You know that. We didn't mean to hurt you." There it was, the familiar framing, explanation without accountability. Intention offered as a substitute for impact. "You didn't miss a meeting," I said quietly. "You missed my graduation." His face hardened, irritation flickering across it. "That again. We said we'd celebrate later." I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, but certainty. "You always say later." He scoffed, shaking his head. "You're being dramatic. Families make sacrifices." "For who?" I asked. The question hung between us, unanswered. He shifted his weight, eyes dropping briefly to the porch floor. He had no response because the truth was too exposed to dress up. He left not long after, frustration radiating off him. The conversation unresolved in the way conversations always are when one person refuses to carry the emotional labor for both. That evening, Vanessa made sure her voice was heard. She showed up where she knew I couldn't easily avoid her. Outside the campus library as students poured out at the end of the day, backpacks slung over shoulders, conversations spilling into the open air. Her hair was perfectly styled, her expression already arranged for an audience. "You really did this," she said loudly, folding her arms. "Mom's a wreck. Dad doesn't sleep. And it's because of you." People slowed down, curiosity sharpening their steps. I didn't look away. "I moved out because you abandoned me," I said evenly. She snapped back instantly. "You knew they depended on that support. You knew how fragile things were." Fragile. That word again, always used to protect her, never used for me. "You skipped my graduation," I said. "That was your choice." Her eyes flashed. "I needed them. I was falling apart." "And I wasn't," I asked. She laughed, sharp and dismissive. "You're always fine. You've always been fine." Something clicked into place with that sentence, a final piece sliding where it belonged. "That's the lie you've been living off," I said. Her voice rose. "You're selfish. You couldn't just wait. You had to make this about you." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "I made it about reality. You're an adult. Am I? And I'm done paying for your comfort." She stared at me, stunned, not because I was cruel, but because I wasn't bending. A few students lingered nearby, pretending not to listen. Vanessa noticed and adjusted, her expression smoothing into something wounded. "You're tearing this family apart," she said louder. "You'll regret this." I didn't raise my voice. If the family falls apart because one person stopped carrying it, then it was never strong to begin with. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time she had no script. I walked away without looking back, my heart pounding not with fear, but with release. Over the next few days, the messages from my parents multiplied and then fractured, alternating between pleading and accusation, confusion and entitlement. Each one confirmed the same truth. They weren't asking how I was. They weren't reflecting on their choices. They were scrambling to restore the system that had kept them comfortable. I stayed silent. Silence, I was learning, is not passive. It is a boundary when words have only ever been used to erase you. And as the pressure continued to build on the other end, I felt myself growing steadier, more rooted, understanding that what they were experiencing wasn't cruelty. It was consequence. The final confrontation didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors the way I once imagined these things did. It arrived politely, almost formally, disguised as an attempt to talk things through. My parents called and asked if I would come back to Detroit for a family meeting. They said it carefully, like the wording itself might make it reasonable. I agreed, not because I felt obligated but because I was done running scenarios in my head. I wanted the truth said out loud, not whispered through voicemails and half-accusations. My grandfather insisted on coming with me. Not to intervene. Not to rescue. To witness. That distinction mattered more than anything. When we walked into the house, everything looked exactly the same. The framed family photos were still aligned perfectly. The furniture sat where it always had. The illusion of order was intact, and for a brief moment I understood how easy it would have been to keep pretending. My mom started crying before anyone sat down. It was immediate and practiced, the kind of crying that filled the room and demanded attention. "We don't understand why you're doing this," she said. "After everything we've done for you." I didn't respond right away. I had learned that rushing to speak only made space for denial to grow. "You didn't come to my graduation," I said calmly. "You didn't even apologize." My dad's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, frustration already bubbling. "We were dealing with a crisis," he said. "Vanessa was not okay." "Tantrum," I corrected. A word that landed like a dropped plate. Vanessa scoffed loudly from across the room. "You're exaggerating. You always do this." My grandfather spoke then for the first time. His voice even and steady in a way that immediately changed the energy in the room. "No," he said. "She's finally telling the truth." All three of them turned toward him, startled. "I've been covering your payments for years," he continued. Quietly. "I believed I was helping both of my granddaughters. What I see now is that I was enabling favoritism." The color drained from my mother's face. "Dad, you don't understand," she said quickly. "I understand perfectly," my grandfather replied. You took her strength for granted and used it as an excuse to neglect her. My father stood up abruptly, anger flaring. So what, he said. You're just cutting us off and letting everything collapse. My grandfather didn't raise his voice. I'm letting you face the consequences of your choices. The room erupted after that. Accusations flew. Vanessa cried loudly, demanding to know how she was supposed to cope now. My mom insisted this was all being blown out of proportion. My dad paced, running his hands through his hair, muttering about loyalty and family. I waited until the noise burned itself out. I'm not here to negotiate, I said. I'm here to be clear. They all looked at me then, really looked like they were seeing a version of me they hadn't planned for. I didn't leave to punish you, I continued. I left because staying was destroying me. I won't move back. I won't fix things for you. And I won't be guilted into carrying what was never mine to hold. My mom whispered my name like it was a plea. So you're choosing this over your family. I met her gaze without flinching. I'm choosing myself for the first time. The silence that followed felt final. Not dramatic, just complete. When we walked out, I didn't feel triumphant. Felt light. Like I had been holding my breath for years and had finally exhaled. Behind us, the perfect picture cracked. And for once, I didn't turn around to save it. The fallout didn't explode the way people expect consequences to. It eroded, slow and relentless. The way structures fail when the hidden supports are removed and nothing is left to compensate. In the days after the family meeting, the messages kept coming, but they changed in texture, losing the confidence they once carried. At first, my parents framed everything as temporary confusion, a rough patch that could be smoothed over if everyone just calmed down. Then the tone shifted to urgency. Bills stacking up. Plans quietly cancelled. Commitments suddenly impossible to meet. I could hear it in their voices when they left voicemails. The tightness that comes when certainty begins to crack. They weren't asking how I was. They weren't reflecting on what they'd done. They were scrambling to understand how things had fallen apart so quickly when, in their minds, nothing fundamental had changed. But something had. I had stopped absorbing the imbalance. And without that, the story they told themselves about who carried what could no longer hold. Extended family started reaching out next, their messages carefully worded. Curiosity disguised as concern. They asked if everything was okay, if there had been a misunderstanding, if stress had made everyone say things they didn't mean. I recognized the pattern instantly. This was how systems protect themselves. They outsource pressure, hoping someone quieter will fold first. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because I was done explaining myself to people who had never questioned the version of events that kept them comfortable. My grandfather noticed the shift before I did. He pointed out how the silence was forcing the truth to surface on its own. Without someone managing perceptions, stories unravel. Friends who once praised my parents' devotion to Vanessa stopped calling. Invitations dried up. The subtle social cushioning that had softened their choices disappeared. Vanessa's crises no longer drew an audience. Without money smoothing the edges and someone else absorbing the consequences, her behavior began to look less fragile and more volatile. That realization spread quietly, the way uncomfortable truths often do, not through confrontation but through absence. My parents tried to reassert control by rewriting the narrative. They told people I was overwhelmed, that college had changed me, that I was confused and needed space. They framed my leaving as a phase. I heard about it through third parties and felt nothing but distance. The story didn't sting anymore because it no longer defined me. I had stepped out of it. When my dad finally called again weeks later, his voice sounded tired in a way I'd never heard before. He didn't accuse or demand. He asked if we could start over, if we could find a way back to normal. Normal, I realized, meant me carrying the weight quietly while everyone else stayed comfortable. I told him no. Not harshly, clearly. I said I was open to respectful contact in the future, but only if it didn't involve expectation, pressure, or guilt. He was quiet for a long time before saying he didn't know how to do that. I told him that was something he would have to learn. After that, The calls stop. Life in Grand Rapids settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first, then deeply grounding. Mornings were quiet. Coffee on the porch. Work that felt focused instead of frantic. Evenings where I didn't brace myself for emotional emergencies that weren't mine to fix. My grandfather never said "I told you so." He didn't need to. He watched me breathe easier, laugh without scanning the room, sleep through the night. He told me once that families reveal themselves most clearly when resources are removed, and that love that only exists under comfort isn't love at all. I carried that with me as the weeks turned into months. The justice in all of it wasn't loud. There were no public apologies or dramatic reckonings. Just reality asserting itself once the distortion was gone. My parents learned what it meant to live within their limits. Vanessa learned what it meant to sit with discomfort without an audience rushing in to save her. And I learned something that changed the way I moved through the world. Self-respect isn't a betrayal. Silence isn't weakness. Walking away doesn't make you cruel. Sometimes it's the only way to stop teaching people that they can build their lives on your disappearance. The collapse didn't announce itself with a single moment of realization on their end. It crept in through logistics, through small humiliations and quiet failures that added up faster than anyone expected. Once the money stopped and the explanations stopped working, reality stepped in where excuses used to live. I heard about it in fragments, never directly, never from them. A mortgage payment missed for the first time. Credit cards declined at places where they had always been waved through without thought. A utility shut-off notice taped discreetly to the door and ripped down before the neighbors could see it. Each detail reached me through someone else's voice, stripped of drama, carrying the weight of inevitability. My parents had spent years presenting stability as something they naturally possessed, not something quietly subsidized. Without that subsidy, the performance unraveled. My mother stopped hosting dinners. My father stopped volunteering for committees that required donations or visible generosity. Their social world shrank in ways that were subtle enough to deny but too consistent to ignore. Vanessa felt it the hardest. Without a constant safety net beneath her emotions, her crises no longer produced immediate relief. She cycled through friends quickly, each one sympathetic at first, then exhausted. Without someone stepping in to translate her volatility into fragility, people began to pull away. She blamed everyone but herself. That part didn't change. What changed was the response. There were no more emergency rescues, no more long explanations offered on her behalf. The consequences landed where they belonged. At first, I waited for the guilt to hit. I expected late nights where I would second-guess myself, imagine worst-case outcomes, feel responsible for damage I hadn't caused. It didn't come. What came instead was a deep, unfamiliar calm. For the first time in my life, I wasn't monitoring anyone else's emotional temperature. I wasn't preparing for calls that would pull me back into old roles. I wasn't negotiating my own boundaries in advance. That absence of vigilance felt strange, almost disorienting, but it was also revealing. I had been carrying so much invisible labor that I didn't recognize rest when it arrived. My parents tried one last angle when practical leverage failed. They appealed to memory, to history, to the idea of who I used to be. My mom sent a message one afternoon that was carefully nostalgic, referencing holidays from years ago, moments framed as proof of closeness rather than convenience. I read it once and felt nothing but distance. Nostalgia is powerful when it's mutual. When it's one-sided, it's just another attempt to avoid accountability. I didn't respond. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. If I replied, the conversation would shift away from truth and back toward expectation. I wasn't willing to participate in that again. My grandfather watched all of this quietly, never inserting himself unless asked, never pushing me toward forgiveness or reconciliation. He understood something my parents never had. That reconciliation without change is just surrender in nicer packaging. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the light fade, he told me that when systems collapse, people often blame the absence rather than the imbalance. They say things fell apart because someone left, not because things were broken long before. That framing protects ego but not truth. Hearing that put words to something I had been feeling without articulating. I wasn't the cause of their instability. I was the mask that had been hiding it. Removing the mask didn't create the problem. It revealed it. As the months passed, the urgency around me faded completely. My parents stopped reaching out through intermediaries. Vanessa stopped showing up where she thought confrontation might force a reaction. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was resolved. I focused on my work, returning to it with a clarity I hadn't known before. Without the constant drain of family expectation, I found energy I didn't realize had been missing. I made decisions based on alignment instead of obligation. I built routines that supported me rather than managing everyone else. Friends noticed the change before I did. They commented on how grounded I seemed, how present. I realized then how much of my life had been lived in anticipation of the next disruption. Without that anticipation, everything slowed down in the best possible way. The consequences my family faced weren't catastrophic. They were corrective. They learned what it meant to live within limits, to face discomfort without outsourcing it, to sit with the results of their own choices. I didn't need to witness it firsthand to know it was happening. The absence of chaos in my own life told me enough. I understood then that justice doesn't always look like confrontation or vindication. Sometimes it looks like disengagement, like allowing reality to function without interference, like stepping far enough away that other people are forced to meet themselves honestly. I didn't feel victorious, felt settled. The kind of settled that comes from no longer fighting against your own awareness. I had seen the pattern clearly and chosen not to repeat it. That choice didn't make me cold or unforgiving. It made me honest. And honesty, I was learning, is often the most disruptive force of all. By the time the dust settled, I realized something important had happened without ceremony or announcement. I had stopped waiting for resolution from them. There was no final conversation that wrapped everything up neatly. No apology that arrived late but sincere. No acknowledgement that rewrote the past in kinder terms, and strangely, I didn't need any of that anymore. The absence of closure became its own kind of answer. In the quiet weeks that followed, I noticed how my body responded to the change before my mind fully caught up. I slept through the night without jolting awake to imagined emergencies. I stopped checking my phone compulsively. I stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened. The constant low-level tension I had mistaken for normal simply dissolved, and in its place was something I hadn't felt in years: steadiness. Not happiness in the dramatic sense, but stability, the kind that lets you breathe without thinking about it. My parents didn't disappear completely at first, they just faded, their messages becoming infrequent and vague, stripped of urgency now that there was nothing left to leverage. When they did reach out, it was careful, almost tentative, as if they were testing whether the old roles still existed. They asked neutral questions, commented on the weather, referenced shared memories without context. Each message carried the same unspoken hope that I would step back into the familiar position of translator, mediator, and fixer. I didn't. I responded politely when it felt appropriate and not at all when it didn't. For the first time, my reactions were guided by self-respect instead of fear of conflict. Vanessa tried a different approach. She sent a long message framed as vulnerability, describing how hard everything had been for her, how abandoned she felt, how unfair it was that I had chosen to leave when she needed support. Reading it, I felt the old reflex stir, the instinct to soothe, to explain, to make room for her pain even when it erased my own. I let the feeling pass. Then I closed the message without replying. It wasn't cruelty. It was recognition. Her pain had always mattered, but mine had never been allowed to exist alongside it. I wasn't willing to keep participating in that imbalance. What surprised me most was how quickly life began to reorganize itself around this new center. Without the constant drain of emotional management, I had space to notice what I actually wanted. I re-engaged with my work in psychology not as a means of proving competence, but as something that genuinely interested me. I took on projects that aligned with my values instead of ones that simply demonstrated resilience. I spent more time with people who didn't require explanation or performance, friendships that felt mutual rather than transactional. Even my relationship with my grandfather shifted, deepening in a way that felt grounded and reciprocal. He never pushed me to reconcile or forgive. He trusted me to know what I needed. That trust did more to heal me than any speech ever could. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I wondered if I had been too firm, if stepping back had caused unnecessary damage, if there was some version of events where everyone could have been okay without me disappearing. Those thoughts never stayed long. They dissolved under the weight of evidence. I remembered the empty seats, text message, the years of quiet adaptation. I remembered how easily my needs had been dismissed when they conflicted with someone else's comfort. Doubt thrives in isolation, but clarity grows when you revisit the truth honestly. Over time, I noticed another shift, one that felt almost surreal. I stopped being angry, not because I had excused what happened, but because anger no longer served a purpose. It had been a signal, not a destination. Once I listened to it and acted accordingly, it softened into something else, acceptance without agreement. I didn't approve of their choices. I simply stopped organizing my life around them. That distinction changed everything. When extended family eventually reached out again, their tone was different, less insistent, more cautious. They had watched what happened when pressure was applied and saw that it no longer worked. I answered honestly when asked and briefly when not. I didn't defend myself or ask to be understood. I let my life speak for itself. The most telling moment came months later when my mother sent a single sentence asking if I would come by sometime soon. No apology, no acknowledgement, just an invitation framed as normalcy. I read it once, felt a flicker of the old ache, and then something steadier rose up underneath it. I realized that returning without accountability would undo the work I had done to protect myself. I didn't respond. Silence, I had learned, isn't avoidance when it's chosen consciously. It's a boundary. Walking away didn't make me heartless, made me whole. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had stopped distorting myself to maintain a version of it that only worked when I was invisible. The distance I created wasn't meant to punish anyone. It was meant to preserve me. And in preserving myself, I finally understood that love without respect isn't love at all. It's expectation. And I was done living under the weight of expectations I never agreed to carry.